money, our medium of exchange, and our financial instruments and the systems built around that could be thought as the root protocol of human society. It's both kind of the emergent artifact of how we interact with each other, but also it is deeply tied in to our behavior patterns. What gives you power? What gives you prestige? How do you make money? What are the profit centers in our society? And if you look at that and you look at what money symbolizes and what it means, it becomes glaringly obvious why we're in the situation we are vis-a-vis planetary health and climate change.
Gregory, I appreciate you being here with me on the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast. For folks who are unfamiliar with you and the work that you do, would you mind briefly introducing us?
Yeah, definitely. Well, hey, Corey, it's great to be here. I'm stoked to be on the podcast. My name's Gregory. My background is in regenerative agriculture, regenerative economics. My focus for many years vocationally was on regenerative agroforestry and supply chain work. And so doing a lot of work with sort of the regenerative certification process in the very early days of that, doing a lot of work with payment for ecosystem service and carbon payments for smallholder farmers in the early days, and just transforming agricultural systems. So my background is my affinity is with farmers associations in Ecuador and Nicaragua and Colombia and other places, working on cacao and coffee and other commodities coming from those tropical agroforestry systems. So sort of and now I'm the founder of Regen Network, along with some other amazing humans. And we at Regen Network, and this vision really is sourced from that more than a decade of on the ground interactions in the agricultural systems, working on building public infrastructure for monitoring ecological health, certifying claims about ecological health, and being able to quantify and mint or create ecological assets like carbon credits, and trying to create a public infrastructure that's open source, transparent, and community owned and governed. Because what I saw over the course of my time working in supply chains and working with farmers, is that there's huge issues with the existing systems of sort of a bureaucratic approach to carbon markets and a bureaucratic approach to certification systems. And really, we need much more radical transparency around that whole process in order to achieve our aims. And so there just needs to be significantly better mechanisms for inclusion of multiple stakeholders along the system. A little anecdote is just the number of times that I saw really great intentions across the entire supply chain, from farmer to logistics and supply companies, manufacturers, brands, and consumers can all have really great intentions about climate action, about social justice and fair trade. But the moment that sort of someone has a significant economic impact in that supply chain and they're forced to make hard decisions about their bottom line, the whole thing tends to crumble. And the actor that loses when things crumble is Earth, the ecosystem itself, the soil, the first place when we as humans get backed into an economic corner or feel like we're backed into an economic corner due to bottom line sort of profit incentives is the planet. And that fundamental truth is really what we're trying to focus on, realigning that economic reality of agriculture and other land use with long-term ecological health, so that the incentives, the structural incentives of all of those actors can be reconnected with ecological health. Because at the end of the day, that is actually what most people want. And so if we can really anchor that back in to our trade relationships, to our fiscal monetary policy, to a financial instrumentation of the economy, it's pretty transformative what can happen.
Mm. Yeah, that is a common thread we have coming up throughout these conversations, is that you can't solve these planetary climate-based issues without solving or addressing the human issues. They're one and the same, and the overlap is extraordinary and a key component of how you need to look at problem solving. So I'm curious, Gregory, how does this work with Regen Network compare to what was your decade of on the ground experience throughout the supply chain with farmers internationally? What do you feel like is the overlap, or maybe some stark differences between what you were doing then and now?
Well, day to day, it's very different. Day to day,
Yeah.
and I've sort of, I'm working in a home office here from my actually maple forest farm here in Western Massachusetts, where we also produce maple syrup and do things. So I do get to kind of like stay connected to my roots a little bit,
Mm,
but predominantly now I'm managing an open source software and open source science company. So
mm,
we had leveraged software and science in the past for our work at Genesis International, which is the firm that I founded before Regen Network. But really, we were focused on a lot of capacity building and engagement directly with farmers and directly with brands, directly in the supply chain. And so the texture of the work now, I'm the CEO of a software company essentially, and that's an entirely new and interesting skill set from the perspective of just learning project management and sort of agile product development and building systems. Productizing is very
mm,
different from consulting and engaging with stakeholders from that level. And it felt like that was really the logical evolution for my path as a eco-social entrepreneur, that really we could sort of identify some of the infrastructure level changes that
mm,
everyone needs to have access to a set of tools to connect decision making and profit essentially to ecological health and well-being, and that in order to achieve that, there really is this need for common scientific and um, uh, verification infrastructure that's
mm,
connected into markets. And that's a product, right? That's not a service.
mm.
Product as a service, perhaps. um, yeah, day-to-day life is really transformed over the last 5 years that I've been focused on Regen Network as my primary project.
Mm. I really enjoy the sequencing though in these careers, and I mean we've had over 200 or so interviews now of like these manifestations of one step versus the other, and different applications of tools and skills and all that kind of stuff, but still very like some kind of core central focus. There's a lot of different ways to address a similar arena or a similar problem as you continue to gain new perspectives and experience. So it seems like it just would have been impossible to do what you're doing now without that decade of experience. And I like to hear from you directly that, yeah, it feels like a full kind of manifestation of that whole experience before.
100%. Yeah, I mean, 100%. I've been on a single thread of
Mhm.
inquiry and kind of going farther and farther up the sort of the metaphorical watershed of,
Mm,
how do we create regenerative landscapes? How do we create a connection between the human economy and the greater than human world in which we are increasing ecological health through our
mm,
economic activity, not just doing less harm, not just sustaining at a current rate, but actually sort of the exhaust of our human economy is ecological regeneration and
mm,
biodiversity and deepening soils and healthier watersheds. That's, that's always been the sort of like the through line of my career, is trying to work on that. And it sort of went from education and consulting and inquiry and entrepreneurship. I started a chocolate business to do direct trade, and that's how I got into supply chains in the first place, was tinkering and playing and trying to create a business that could connect smallholder agroforestry cacao farmers in Ecuador and Nicaragua directly to customers. And this was back like 2008, 2009, 2010, sort of like working on what at that time was pretty radical, trying to do subscription agreements with people, trying to do direct trade, trying to do traceability, trying to offset carbon. I think we were a little like before our time for a small business, but it was great. It was a huge learning. And, I ended up exiting that business and basically cycling the small proceeds from selling that business into purchasing a farm in the community that I was sourcing from and turning it into an experimental center, essentially,
Wow.
around permaculture and agroforestry stuff. And that continues to this day and is so fundamental, sort of like that being woven in to a community in that way, and thinking, what are the real structural challenges, because a lot of times those of us who have this intuition that the world could be different, that we could center social and ecological health in business itself, then we go out into the world and we find all of these structural incentives that make that so hard, right? Again, as I was saying, there's just sort of good intentions won't get us there, right? Because we so oftentimes get put into the place as atomized individuals in a giant chaotic marketplace, and people have to make hard decisions, right? And again, the stakeholder that loses first when those hard decisions are forced is Earth, and then the next, then it's sort of like a privilege pyramid, and the people who are most vulnerable, it goes against them next, and then next, and then next, and that's just sort of the way the system works, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge that system is the accumulation of precedent, and it's the accumulation of decisions, and it's the accumulation of agency. I'm not sort of a conspiracy theorist, really. I think that this is kind of the emergent system of a lot of people stumbling around and doing the best that they could over time, right? And it is just that, it's a human manifestation. It's cultural, it's social. And one of the amazing things about humans is we can evolve our culture, and we can change our society, and we can create new economic tools. And something that I've come to really firmly believe, and maybe we'll get in more depth into this as we go through the podcast here, is that money, our medium of exchange, and our financial instruments and the systems built around that could sort of be thought as the root protocol of human society. It's both kind of the emergent artifact of how we interact with each other, but also it is sort of deeply tied in to our behavior patterns. What gives you power? What gives you prestige? How do you make money? What are the profit centers in our society? And if you look at that, and you look at like what money symbolizes and what it means, it becomes glaringly obvious why we're in the situation we are, vis-a-vis planetary health and climate change, right? And so, but again, I believe that's malleable. Like that's actually something that we can both have public discourse, and we can have direct agency and interact with to evolve that system. And I guess my provocation to listeners is to envision a world in which the source, the fountain of money, the source of money, the source of wealth is a reflection of ecological health, right? And that's because that is actually the foundation of all of our material economy. It's the foundation of our personal health, right? And so I think there is an opportunity right now, because of just the unique circumstances we find ourselves in, this moment in history, with the rise of cryptocurrency and blockchain, with economic instability, just with really radically evolving awareness and understanding becoming more and more ubiquitous around human impact and climate change, circular economy, sustainability, all of these things kind of intersecting at this moment to really, reinvent the economics of land use and reinvent the economics of agriculture specifically, and create a new approach. And it can be, it may even appear incremental, but the transformation is going to be
Mm.
pretty profound, I think. And so, that's really that the last sort of, bow I'll put on that package is just this concept of social construction of value, and
Mm.
right, this understanding that all money systems and all forms of value emerge because of social consensus, uh, not because of some exterior intrinsic, like gold isn't actually valuable because of its commodity value in your smartphone or something, in the
Mm.
places that it's used in the material economy. And the US dollar is valuable because we have confidence in it, not
Mhm.
because of some intrinsic, fact. It's the social contract and construction of value that's really at the core. And I think at a large level, our quest at Regen Network, and this isn't readily apparent, I think, to most people, because we have this go-to-market strategy around voluntary carbon credits from smallholder agroforestry farmers and grazers, and sort of connecting all of that in a system of transparency. But what we're really doing is trying to reconnect the social construction of value to
Mm.
ecological health. As I was
Mm.
mentioning before, just really, there is a greater than human reality, and we can center our provisioning and unitization and accounting systems, right? Our money on that. That is a possible place to source value and sort of like imbue that into our economy. And I
Mm.
think that if we achieve that, sort of what I was saying earlier, regeneration will be the natural outcome of economic activity, not
Mm.
something that we have to sort of like force ourselves into with moral arguments. And, it's actually just, we can design that as an outcome.
Mm.
So,
Well, it makes me think someone who I think you might know of, Neil Spackman, by chance. We had
yeah,
a
definitely.
conversation just
Mhm.
yesterday, actually, and he made mention that we're not destructive by nature, but by habit, and it seems like that you're reiterating a lot of that sentiment here. Is that that's through cultures we created narratives and themes that have just kind of been the prevailing of a lot of disparate parts trying to of people trying to do their best, whatever the circumstance it is. It's oriented to a way that is more destructive than not. But there is likewise that ultimate potential for it to not be that way, to be in fact regenerative instead of degenerative. Um, and Gregory, I'm curious. I guess tactically speaking, if we're thinking about the supply chain of food and agriculture, and you mentioned all these different component parts where there are losers in this conversation when there's disconnect throughout the incentive process, the incentive structure. How tactically is the work that Regen Network is doing, looking to establish equilibrium throughout that, to bring together, as you mentioned, the ecological health with the as well the incentive of economic growth?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways that we're approaching that. Uh, the first way is to create a direct market for ecosystem services like carbon credits, in which the 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 quality of claims and the price for making, like, creating a carbon credit. The quality is higher and the price is lower, and there's a direct payment system.
Mm.
So currently in carbon markets, especially for land use, natural climate solutions, or agriculture, forestry, and other land use, as it's variously spoken about in literature, uh, oftentimes up to 80% of the value of a carbon credit is sort of taken up by the middle of the market, the brokers, the verifying agencies, the certifications, like a lot of passing back and forth, and only 20% is actually getting to the project, getting to the farmer or the forester, the land steward, the communities that are responsible for the stewardship. And so one of the big, intervention points that we're aiming at Regen Network is flipping that completely, so that at least 80% of the value is going directly to the land steward. And that's already something that we've accomplished in the credits, sort of the natively produced Regen Network credits that have been minted and sold. For instance, our Carbon Plus Grasslands program, the full amount of credits, and these were issued back in 2020, was purchased by Microsoft. And this was Carbon Plus Grasslands was a regenerative rotational grazing based credit that used satellite imagery and direct sampling on the ground to produce very accurate estimations of the soil organic carbon and the change in the stock of carbon over time as the land managers were practicing rotational grazing. At 85% of that purchase went directly to the land stewards, right? And that's sort of the precedent that we're working to set. So that's number one. The second piece is really building a community governed platform. So what we're not building a sort of proprietary approach to the monitoring, verification, and asset management infrastructure. We're building an open source, community owned infrastructure using blockchain technology. And so what that means is that there is a large proportion that's governed. This whole concept of Regen Network is community governed through the Regen token. And there's a significant set of Regen tokens that have been set aside and are only available to land stewards and scientists, indigenous people, not-for-profit organizations that traditionally, in the way that businesses oftentimes evolve, would be an afterthought or excluded. And in this case, they have sort of a founder level allocation of governance, and both that offers both sustainable financial upside by staking those tokens, securing the network. It also offers power to govern the network in their benefit. And we really feel like that is sort of one of the foundational transformative steps that we're taking at Regen Network, is to ensure that the market mechanisms that are being evolved are governed by the stakeholders that really this impacts the most, right? And that means land stewards. That doesn't just mean like private equity firms or or crypto speculators or whoever it might be that thinks, oh, look, natural capital assets and carbon markets, these are bound to be huge, so we'll buy and sort of like engage in that. Yes, we need, those are, capital, the financial capital, and those stakeholders in the economy are really important, and taking capital risk is important. And this isn't sort of like excluding them. It's just saying that actually their investments will be more secure, and this whole system will work much better if the voices of the people who provide the foundational value of the system, which are land stewards, are deeply interwoven in owning, governing, and having financial upside as the network grows.
Would you mind drawing out the implications a little bit more for the various stakeholders, stewards that you mentioned? Like, what does this mean for them on a day to day, in the context of farmers, on seasonally, like what does this mean for them in their lives and their livelihoods? What this power that you're talking about can offer them.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of levels. And again, to sort of reiterate, the basic level that is the one that's sort of like most short-term transformative is the ability to bring to market ecosystem services in addition to crops. So it
Mm,
adds a whole new income stream,
right.
right? So that's the basic building block. And then there's also this opportunity, and not everyone is going to choose this, right? To participate in governing and engaging with the network. That also has a financial incentive because people can uh, be granted these staking tokens and then be earning somewhere around at the moment 20% interest essentially for staking those tokens. And that's direct, like every day receiving essentially passive, almost like a universal basic income for
Mm,
participating in the network. So that is also can be significantly transformative in the short term in terms of people's finances. It also is connecting you with a financial network that allows frictionless direct payment. So you could also
mm,
easily start selling produce beyond your ecosystem services or engaging with crowdfunding. And you basically have an account that people can just stream money to very quickly. So there's like a financial access opportunity that I think in the short term is pretty transformative. And then in the mid and long term, this is about essentially equity in the system and governance in the system. But that's work, right? That isn't
mm,
just like you just are getting it. In order for
mm,
that to be valuable, you need to be exercising agency and being educated and and my sense is that a lot of the activity really is going to happen through community organizations, not necessarily individual farmers. And that it's
mm,
this opportunity, which we call the community staking endowment process, is we've found better fit at the sort of association or co-op level, or sort of representative NGOs that are able to sort of like resource that process of engagement in at the infrastructure level and governance level. Whereas a lot of, especially smallholder farmers, but even large farmers are probably not going to have the time. You're just kind of in the daily grind. You got to just do the thing that you need to do as a farmer. And so,
mhm,
the big transformation for them is just shifting the bottom line economics of agriculture and aligning
mm,
that with ecological health.
mm. And so you mentioned ecosystem services, and then we've brought up ecological health quite a bit. Is that purely being measured based off of the quantity of carbon in the soil, or are there other ways in which that's being assessed and determined valuable?
Yeah, there's other ways. So carbon is the primary unit of the emerging market for natural capital or ecosystem services, and there's a wide variety of approaches. And Regen Network, although we're focused at the moment on the voluntary carbon markets, we're really building an infrastructure that sort of can embrace a full definition of ecological assets and ecosystem services and an economy built on that.
Mm,
Um, there's currently about 40 different projects producing eco credits for the Regen Network marketplace. And those eco credits run the gamut from soil carbon to forestry carbon projects to blue carbon projects to biodiversity units that are completely independent of carbon claims. There's an amazing group called Era Brazil, which is producing a credit class focused on jaguar conservation and biodiversity, in which the
mm,
unit of account is essentially it's like a jaguar hectare, right?
mm,
And it's not built to be a credit in the sense that it gives you some rights to degrade landscapes somewhere else. It's offering the proof of and maintenance of this, very important habitat for this keystone species, and offering an opportunity for people to value that in a new way, right? Not sort of like, oh, we've trashed this, so we're going to offset it over there. So that's a non-offsetting credit or unit type that's being built there, which is quite exciting. And there's marine conservation credits that
Mm.
similarly are not representing sort of a tit for tat balance sheet approach. They're representing the imperative to create no catch zones and maintain marine conservation as a fundamental element of biosphere health. And so the audience or marketplace for those credits is going to be both transnational organizations and intergovernmental organizations that have these mandates to achieve goals, right? But this is an instrument that allows them to have verifiable results, right? In
Mm.
which the money that they're spending is attached to the ecological integrity that they're actually responsible for producing with that money. So it's not like a carbon credit in the same way, although we call them all at the moment, all of those are types of eco credits. So there's a pretty
Mm.
broad gamut of experimentation. Some of these have existing markets. Carbon credits has a healthy and growing existing marketplace, right? Biodiversity credits are, they're new. It's a nascent market. People don't know what this market may or may not look like, but we're trying to support significant experimentation in this full spectrum, because that's really core to our strategy at Regen Network, is this idea that there needs to be a wide spectrum of innovation
Mm.
around how we account for ecological health and regeneration and weave that into our economy.
Mm. And so I'm wondering, where is the constraint or like the bottleneck on the growth? Is it like the demand and the pace in which the market is emerging for this, or is it y'all's ability to just accumulate more acreage essentially and get more
Yeah.
farmers and ranchers and stewards on board?
Supply.
Like,
The supply is the bottleneck.
okay,
Yeah, no, the
gotcha.
demand is there. Market demand is there. Demand outpaces supply year over year in these markets. The challenge is accelerating supply that is of the appropriate quality. The challenge is overcoming um, the time to market, because this is
Mm.
both these credits represent ecological time. They don't represent time in the marketplace.
Hmm.
We're grounding these assets into long carbon cycles. So there's that element, and then there's also the element of the science involved to develop the appropriate level of methodological rigor for the counterparties who are making the agreement about these assets to agree. And
Mm.
that's a variable, right? We're creating an open and transparent system where what's most important is that people know what they're agreeing to in relationship to an ecological asset, right? So it's an
Mm.
open and standard agnostic system. It can incorporate existing standards, and new standards can be created in Regen Network
Mm.
and on the system that we call Regen Registry, where you can register a methodology and a credit class and then start to bring that to market. So we're sort of agnostic to that. And then we create tools for people to curate or generate new standards. And again, the purpose here is to create a market in which it's very transparent what the claim is, who's backing it, what the data is that backs it, and what the value has been determined for that claim, but not to impose that. Because again, if you look at sort of the history of carbon markets and you look at the history of ecosystem service markets, many of these systems have failed when there's sort of a top heavy, top down approach in which you have people who are not embedded in the context really imposing standards for all
Mm.
of this. So you have to balance. You need to include the community in the process about what's being agreed and why, and you need to include scientists in the process. And, we're just sort of trying to disintermediate and open up the playing field for a wide variety of innovation in the creation of new methodologies and credit classes.
Mm. And so you mentioned the community and the impact of the community of the Regen network. I'm curious, what has that experience been like in like bringing what it is, the solution you're offering with Regen Network, to this community of people involved in the agricultural space? Has it been easy to get like champions of those standards and what it is that y'all are doing? Or has there been some, like, have the conversations and stuff, I guess, shaped in different ways over the years since you started? But I'm interested, like, there is some interesting experience of just having this self-organizing, self-directed community, uh, uh, and especially being, I don't know, the position you are in Regen, like overseeing that whole thing. It's this weird kind of like meta level. Like there's a lot of different things going on, I guess, at the same time. Anyways, I'm interested to hear what that experience has been like of cultivating and watching this community grow.
Well, there's really been different phases. And, I would say in the early days, there were very few people who were sympathetic to the a pretty radical approach that
Mm,
I have always felt was imperative.
mm,
So from founding Regen Network, there was a set of assumptions that I had that led me to believe that this sort of open, community owned, self organizing approach was really the only way that it would work.
mm.
Not just ideologically, like, oh, this is groovy and we want to do it this way, but actually that this is the only way. This accounting for public goods needs to be public infrastructure. And and one of the assumptions I've always had is that natural capital and carbon markets are going to be the most important capital markets of the 21st century. And I don't really have any fear or doubt that these markets are going to be giant, trillions of
Mm,
dollars per year. And so I haven't really personally, and at Regen Network, we don't spend a lot of time trying to convince people that carbon or natural capital is important. We just sort of take it as a foundation that it is important, and people will either see that or they won't.
mm,
But given that it's going to be important, and given that it's going to be really big, the foundation for us is always, how do we avoid a subprime carbon bubble? How do we avoid collapses in market mechanisms? That who will that impact? Who does it
mm,
impact if there's a giant natural capital market that collapses? Well, it'll impact two stakeholders primarily. It'll impact the earth, and it will impact the small, like the most fragile participants, which in this case, ironically, are the most important participants because they're the ones
yeah.
providing the value, and that's the land stewards. So, okay, so I have to say, in the phases of community building, at the beginning, being quite radical about that was a really hard sell for
Mm,
nearly every stakeholder. Of course, farmers heard it and they were stoked to be acknowledged in that way, but I think they also were pretty skeptical, right? I mean,
yeah.
this is a big vision and it's a big talk, and like, okay, this is going to take years, and it's true. It's going to take all of this. I mean, we're 5 years in, and we're just a month away from really launching sort of like what you might consider the minimum viable manifestation of all of this. We, like,
Mm,
up until now, there's a lot of market movement, and we've been facilitating purchases and retirements and all sorts of things, but that all happens via command line interface. It's sort of like OTC, over the counter trading, and there's humans behind, and we're still doing it this old way as we're building this infrastructure for that, to basically remove ourselves at R&D Inc. from the middle of that, right?
mm,
It's taken 5 years. It's taken 5 years to get to the point where this infrastructure is now ready as public infrastructure that we're only a small stakeholder in. That there's 13,000 addresses now
mm,
that are governing Regen Ledger. the blockchain that
Mm.
secures Regen network. There's 40 plus people developing their own eco credits. There's 75 people running validator nodes. So every continent except for Antarctica is running the software to maintain this ecological state consensus that is the backbone for the marketplace. So it's taken 5 years to build the community to that level, which is just a
Mm.
tiny fraction of what it really needs to be if this is going to be effective in actually meeting land steward needs to shift their economic dynamic to be valued for ecological health and regeneration first and foremost as one of the primary services that they're providing to the global community. So, a resistance at the beginning. Now there's been a big arc. And then that arc, two things have happened. Number one is what we took for granted in the early days, that carbon markets and natural capital is just going to be baked in to the economic reality of the future. That is now shifted from being unorthodox to being essentially accepted by every financial institution, company, government, VC. Everybody's shouting that from the rooftops, and there's like a giant stampede in that direction. So that's
Yeah.
made it significantly, that's shifted the dynamics and accelerated, adoption and assumptions and facilitated conversations radically. So that's number one, that's changed. And, we're like a drop in the bucket of that change. That's a big cultural shift that we've been participating in, but obviously we just have our little corner of the world in which we've been talking about that and socializing that. And then the second shift is really how broadly accepted Web3 and blockchain as an important technology for the next iteration of finance, the internet of money, governance, and the suite of tools that it unlocks to have these global distributed ledgers. This is also no longer fringe. And there's institutional buy-in around this. And sure, there's turbulence and skeptics, but also it's just reached a whole different level of people's understanding that having public consensus and a public blockchain and public infrastructure around certain things is enormously helpful. And it turns out that one of the things that blockchain is most adept at accelerating and proving and building a solid foundation for is this sort of public goods accounting, where
Mm.
you need a public capture proof record in which multiple stakeholders can rely on transparent and available data and claims and market mechanisms and governance for these goods, these ecological assets that are quantifying public goods that benefit everyone, right? It benefits everyone when carbon is sequestered into the soil of a farm somewhere. It benefits everyone when a portion of the Amazon is protected and the lungs of the Amazon are allowed to continue to pump the global water cycle. Those are public goods, and therefore they really do need sort of a public system for accounting for the value system and exchange. You can't accomplish that. Just imagine a world in which a giant company like Amazon, for instance, had the satellites, owns the satellites that are doing the monitoring, owns the servers that store the data, owns the algorithms that are generating the models, and is buying the credits from itself or selling them out into the market. The trust chain in that is untenable, right? You can't,
Mm-hmm.
you like, we simply can't, and I don't think society wouldn't, like, people wouldn't trust that. You
Mm-hmm.
need we have to create an institutional decentralization of the trust apparatus so that different counterparties can check in on claims. That's the foundation of this sort of accounting for public goods. You really need a community owned infrastructure, and you need community provision of verification services to just as a foundational piece to make it all work. And I think Yeah, I think that's more and more obvious to more and more people. Even the big folks who may be in position to sort of like capture and black box pieces of it. I mean, it's obvious if you play out how that goes, how that will undermine trust and therefore the value of the very assets that they may wish to accumulate or use to offset their emissions or achieve specific goals.
Mm. And so, is there a radically different uptime, or I guess sell to potential community members, farmers, ranchers internationally? Like, are you having to have wildly different conversations with farmers in the U.S., for example, versus I don't know, rural Brazil, in the Amazon forest, for example?
It's
Like,
very
are those
different.
conversations quite different? Yeah.
It's very different. I will say that at the moment, we're not really, well, at R&D Inc., and so there's multiple organizations. This is a network, R&D Inc., Regen Network Development Incorporated, which is a benefit corp in Delaware that I'm the CEO of. We develop software and we develop science. We also build community, but our real core role is science, and engineering work, software development. Um, and again, we do community building and we engage, but the community that we're most focused on is actually project developers,
Mm,
methodology developers, organizations that are scientifically capable and financially capable to develop a new credit class and bring it to market is the
mm,
constituency or the network stakeholder that we interact with most, and that we're sort of at this moment in time, we consider our primary sort of like user focus. The foundation, right, which manages the endowment, this community staking endowment, one of their primary constituents and their primary focuses is land stewards, while also
mm,
project developers, NGOs, standards bodies, and scientists, right? And so at the moment, they're doing a lot more conversing with farmers in the Amazon or in Africa or in India. And I will say that it's going to be some time. There's going to be a process of capacity building and engagement and courtship and trust building to invite land stewards into the network to sort of like be full participants. And we don't expect that, and we're not trying, there's no hard selling, there's no real rush. That's something that is baked into the design, and that there's a 501c3 foundation that is explicitly, its board and its executive director are responsible for stewarding that process over time. This isn't
mm,
something that is expected to happen overnight, right? Because it is hard, and farmers, for very good reasons, tend to be conservative because they
mm,
tend to be watching natural cycles. They tend to be engaging with businesses, and they can tinker and experiment, and most farmers are highly experimental and highly like creative in that way, but you have to mitigate your experiments impact on the whole farm. You don't want to bet the farm, in quotes, on big changes. And so yeah, I know that. I'm both a farmer and have worked with farmers for a long time. So the goal in relating to that constituency is to really create experimental opportunities that are low risk and allow creativity and engagement, so trust can be built, they can input what they need to, and then over time, sort of like they can, if it makes sense, they can sort of step more and more fully into engagement. But as I
mm,
mentioned, at the moment, the major, I guess, user stakeholder that we're focused on R&D Inc. really is this project developer archetype. People like Era Brazil, for instance, which does carbon project development in Brazil and internationally, and is focused on this Jaguar contract, or Neil Spackman, Regenerative Resources
mm.
Company, and the work they're doing with mangroves. We've been working with them on methodologies and NFTs and other elements to support what they're doing. So it's sort of entrepreneurs who are focused on developing ecological assets and then are working with farmers and land stewards to engage with them. Um, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. I appreciate you spelling that out for me. There are a lot of intricate working parts in this entire network and various collected entities. But just to shift a little bit, Gregory, before we start to wrap up, I'm always quite interested in what's kind of spurred people's connection to uh, uh, doing a business that pursues explicit good, explicitly making an effort to use your skills and capacities to leave the world a better place than you found it. And so you mentioned, there's something about that intuition that you have seen that the world could be a bit different. And you mentioned as well that you were in the business you started a little bit before your time. I'm wondering what sort of influences or experiences did you have in your life that had that be something of a no-brainer for you, that you would explore things like direct trade, agroforestry, all these things that seemed, maybe in that current context a bit radical to external parties, or like you were speaking a different language. Like why were you there at those points in time? And uh, um, yeah, what's inspired you towards work that serves a type of purpose like this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's been cumulative over the years. I certainly grew up with a strong affinity and connection with nature and the wild. I grew up in Alaska. Um, I think it was pretty formative for me. I growing up, I worked on all of the different sides of the salmon fishery.
Mm,
Um, grew up working from a very early age, and I worked as a commercial fisherman. I worked with the local watershed forum that was monitoring the fishery and water quality. I worked with Fish and Game, running studies. When I was in college. So I kind of got. I worked at the canneries, processing and other things. That was my first job. So that seeing all the different stakeholders centered around a natural resource in quotes, which is this
mm,
thriving fishery, which is
mhm,
considered to be the best, one of the best. The Alaskan fisheries is held up in quotes, natural resource management as one of the best examples of managing a natural resource in a multi-stakeholder governance way. So I was sort of like embedded in that. I also saw, both that it was kind of working, but also that it was kind of not working, right? And there were ways in which, it was clearly could work better, but had some stability. It's working, but maybe there's improvements to make, tinkering, playing with. I think that was pretty foundational for me, that experiment, that experience growing up. And those were my first jobs, and that was my first sort of exposure to, yeah, just both hard work and just seeing multiple sides of something. And
mm,
I studied environmental science uh, in college. So I think that's all pretty foundational for me. And then I have to say, one of the big transformative experiences for me. While I was studying environmental science, I was privileged enough, lucky enough, really. It's a big blessing. I spent 6 months studying in the Galapagos,
mm,
studying marine and terrestrial ecology. So both the island ecosystem itself and then the marine ecosystem underlying it, and sort of the human political economy around that, both the science and the tourism and the fishery, these sort of competing economic interests and land use. And so I was immersed in that, and I saw things happening there that were just completely crazy making, you know,
mm,
and where the way to accomplish a goal was totally out of balance with you might say sanity, and
mm.
specifically, I had this experience of just watching a helicopter gunship shoot, like machine gunning goats.
Oh, jeez.
And that was really startling and pretty upsetting. Um, and the goal here was to return this island ecosystem to a pristine, wild, pre-goat, you know, place. But the method of doing so was expensive, was using fuel, was highly militarized, and ultimately completely unsuccessful. and and it just made me think, there are clear examples of the extirpation of species due to hunting pressure, for instance, all over the world.
Yeah.
So, like, and I'm not even saying that the best idea there was to remove the goats. Just agnostic and independent of that. If you decide as a group of stakeholders that you want to remove the goats from the island, there are a lot of better ways than sending a helicopter gunship to go hunt the goats, right? People would travel from all over the world to go on goat hunting Galapagos safari and then do some other things and learn about evolution, feel like they're doing service for the environment and pay a huge amount of money. You could actually raise money for the national park of the Galapagos and solve that problem if people were just to think and to use incentives, right? So what does it look like to auction off goat hunting licenses and then use that money to do some other things? That experience, like both having that jarring emotional experience of like, wow, that is so messed up, and also just knowing clearly that there were some easily better ways to accomplish that outcome if that's what everybody wants, by doing a little bit of design work and some incentive design. I think that was pretty formative in my, both the world could be better and better in some pretty practical, pragmatic, clear ways that are achievable, not just better in an abstract way, but better in the sort of like, you could talk to people and come up with a plan, and that could actually probably change. That's actually something that could change, and it would have a pretty big impact. And where are there other places in these scales of our human world where that sort of intervention could actually result in a really radical transformation for the better, economically and just, I guess, psychologically, because this is fairly traumatizing.
Wow. So, it certainly sounds like it. But man, Gregory, I appreciate you sharing. I want to be respectful of your time here, and so before we wrap up, you mind if I ask you a few rapid fire questions?
Go for it.
All right. So first one, what's maybe a book or film or some sort of resource that you might recommend to our listeners? Something that's impacted you recently, or something you always come back to one way or another?
I would highly recommend listeners check out either the Audible or audiobook version or the print version of Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. In it, he describes a global carbon reward system of linking money generation to ecological regeneration and carbon reduction, which is super cool in and of itself. But Kim Stanley Robinson is sort of the OG sci-fi ecologist writer, nearest and dearest to my heart. And the book is so practical and inspiring and a beautiful overview of a real movement of people that are working, but sort of set in the future with some dynamic characters. It's really just a lovely book for our times.
Excellent recommendation. A next one for you, and this might be particular to you. What's maybe one of your favorite or your favorite task attached to the farm and being a farmer?
Oh, so different farms, different places. But here in Western Massachusetts at our maple farm, I love tapping the maples. And I'm a recent maple farmer. This is new to me, but learning and just snowshoeing in in early February, getting out into the woods. It's a beautiful, beautiful time of year. The light is magic. Everything is white. It's calm, and going out with a crew of folks with some hot tea and tapping the maple trees is one of the most beautiful sort of agroforestry or agricultural activities I think I've had the pleasure to do. So I'm looking forward to next year, and just that ritual of tapping is really lovely.
Sounds lovely. Final one for you. What's one piece of advice that you might leave our listeners with? These people are change makers and innovators from all sectors, all over the globe, looking to leave the world a better place than they found it.
Well, this may be sort of like too trite, or this may be too just like not specific enough, but I think this is something I try to tell myself, so I guess I'll tell it to everybody else. I think be brave and bold in your willingness to take risks, to build a better world and do what you know is right. All we have is our time and attention. And if we're not giving that time and attention to something that is connected to planetary health, to the health of your neighbors, to the health of this beautiful world we live on, what are we even doing? And so, just being brave and reminding yourself that the risks of being an entrepreneur and are worth it, at the end of the day. And we may fail as entrepreneurs, but it's the most important thing we can be doing, is to be risking our time and attention, to cooperate with other people, to change the world. And specifically, I'm very passionate about change society to honor and regenerate ecological health. That's the task of our generation. And so it's more confusing and it's less clear than maybe the generational tasks that preceded us. But at this moment, there's complexity and there's subtlety and there's confusion, but be brave and keep putting your time and attention into what you know is right.
Excellent advice for us to end on. Finally, Gregory, where is the best place to keep up with you and the work of Regen Network? Where would you like to direct folks?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Gregory_Landua, Regen.network. If you're interested in technical docs, docs.regen.network if you're a computer geek. If you're interested in the science behind all of this and registry of methodologies and standards and development of those, library.regen.network. There's all sorts of stuff. There's a Discord server where people are land stewards and scientists. There's all sorts of amazing community members. It's really quite vibrant. And if you're interested, I also do a podcast where I speak to a lot of the community members. So you get a chance to hear conversation with land stewards and scientists and engineers. And I even did a couple hour-long episode with Kim Stanley Robinson about Ministry for the Future a while back. I'm just starting to kick that back up into gear. So that's called the Planetary Regeneration Podcast.
Lovely. All right. We'll have all things linked up in our show post at socialentrpreneurship.fm. Gregory, thank you so much for taking the time.
Corey, it was fantastic. Such a fan and excited for the work that you're doing to help build community and educate people about social entrepreneurship and building a better world.